Good morning. I am back at my kitchen counter, and Heather got to come with me this morning. She hasn't been out in a while, and I am excited to be talking about the book of Romans with you. We're up to chapter 7. Now, Paul is talking to a new Christian community. They've become Christians in faith, and because it's like, 75 AD, they don't quite know what's going on in terms of this life, and they have been Jewish, and they still consider themselves Jewish. Again, Christianity was first a reform movement within Judaism, but they're not quite sure how the old way of life as Jews fits into this new way of life as Christians. And so Paul has been in the last couple of chapters, and will be in chapter 7, talking about the law and how it, hey Annie, and how it has been usurped by this new life in Christ. So when this first half of chapter 7 has to do with that law being outdated, and he uses the imagery of marriage and a spouse dying, and anyway, we'll get into it, but just know that marriage image is one that Paul is using to explain how the law was inadequate and actually doesn't have any hold over these new Jewish Christians, even though they've grown up with it all their lives. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say is that for these people who Paul is writing to, it seems reasonable to believe that they had grown up within a Jewish community where everybody was Jewish. Everybody was the same, and they all followed the same law. So it was very clear what was the law and what wasn't the law, and they all had that same focus in terms of how to live. It's something that we don't experience. I mean, I've never lived in a community that was all my faith commitment, but also my type of faith commitment. Because as Christians in this generation, we tend to pick and choose what we think is important or appropriate. So anyway, let's get on to Paul. He's working in a community that's much clearer about God's law, and he wants to give them a good image to help them understand that the law doesn't have a hold on them anymore. Okay, chapter 7. You shouldn't have any trouble understanding this, friends, for you know all the ins and outs of the law, how it works and how its power touches only the living. For instance, a wife is legally tied to her husband while he lives, but if he dies, she's free. If she lives with another man while he's living, she's obviously an adulteress. But if he dies, she's quite free to marry another man in good conscience with no one's disapproval. So, my friends, this is something like what has taken place with you. When Christ died, he took the entire rule-dominated way of life down with him and left it in the tomb, leaving you free to marry a resurrection life and bearing offspring of faith for God. For as long as we lived that old way of life, doing whatever we felt we could get away with, sin was calling most of the shots as the old law code hemmed us in and made us all the more rebellious. In the end, all we could show for it was miscarriages and stillbirths. But now we're no longer shackled to the domineering mate of sin and out from under all those oppressive regulations and fine print. We're free to live a new life in the freedom of God. But I can hear you say, if the law code was as bad as all that, it's no better than sin itself. That's certainly not true. The law code was perfectly legitimate function. Without its clear guidelines for right and wrong moral behavior would be mostly guesswork. Apart from the succinct surgical command, you shall not covet, I could have dressed covetousness up and have it look like a virtue and ruin my life with it. Don't you remember how it was? I do perfectly well. The law code started out as an excellent piece of work. What happened, though, was that sin found a way to pervert the command into temptation making a forbidden fruit out of it. The law code, instead of being used to guide me, was used to seduce me. Without all the paraphernalia of the law code, sin looked pretty dull and lifeless, and I went along without paying much attention to it. But once sin got its hands on the law code and decked itself out in all that finery, I was fooled and I fell for it. The very command that was supposed to guide me into life was cleverly used to trip me up, throwing me headlong. So sin is plenty alive, and I was stone dead. But the law code itself is God's good and common sense, which command sane and holy counsel. I can already hear your next question. Does that mean I can't even trust what is good? That is the law? Is good just as dangerous as evil? No, again. Sin is simply did what sin was so famous for doing, using the good as a cover to tempt me to do what would finally destroy me. By hiding within God's good command, sin did far more mischief than it could ever have accomplished on its own. Good morning, folks. So that's the first 13 verses of chapter 7. And it might sound a bit confusing, but partly it's just because we're not the initial audience for this. We are people who have not lived with a law a great deal. Although we live with the 10 Commandments and we believe they're important, they're not as talked about or perhaps as important to us as our relationship with Jesus. And so really what he's saying here, and probably you got it, is the old law code that had weighed down the Jewish communities is been usurped. It has been put aside for this relationship in God. And that law code was a good law code. Do not kill, do not covet, do not commit adultery. All of those are really good ways to live in a community. Or, the basic don't do to someone else what you wouldn't want them to do to you. All of those things are really very straightforward. However, what Paul is saying here, which I think is so, so true, is that God gives us a good way to live in community, a good way to be honest and fair in the way that we live with others, and sin really messes it up. I mean, the story that comes to mind is King David when he takes Bathsheba because he sees her on the roof showering, and that's what he wants. And so of course Bathsheba is married to Uriah, and so he keeps on sending him to the front of the battle, trying to get him killed off, because he's like, oops, I went and had sex with somebody else's wife. Well, I have the power to get him killed and it'll all be good. And so that's really kind of the law that is manipulated that Paul said that we do. And of course we all do it. And for me, the imagery that's helpful for me, not so much what Paul is giving me, but the imagery that's been in my mind for a long time was raising sons. Because my sons, you could give them the law. This is the law. You need to get in bed and go to sleep. Well, they would get in bed and not so much go to sleep. Well, I was in bed. I got half of it done. Or I always thought my first son would be a great lawyer, because the minute you would catch him doing something he knew he wasn't supposed to do, he would have 15,000 different angles and understanding of why really it wasn't wrong. And he hadn't really done anything that he wasn't supposed to. It was just my way of looking at it wasn't exactly right. So I very quickly understood God more. I've often said I never understood God as much as when I was trying to parent children. But, and the difference that Paul is talking about, the law code is good. It's good in terms of how we live. And Paul, the one that he holds up is covetousness. Is desiring what somebody else has, wanting what they've got. And again, that's all a TV commercial is. Or half the streaming that we see on our phones is wanting something somebody else has got and thinking that's going to make life better. And so our culture does that a lot. And he says that, yes, that's exactly right. That what happens is that sin dresses itself up in finery. And so covetousness isn't, oh, it's not covetousness. Oh, it's just that I really need that. It's just that, I should have that too, because that would really be helpful for my life. But of course, we've seen it with somebody else and we want it for ourselves. So all of those laws, as I said, with my sons, I understood the difference between understanding the rules that I tried to get them to follow and them doing it grudgingly and only when I was watching them, and knowing that they might do it outwardly, but in their head they were going, this is ridiculous and I'm not really going to do this. So it was the difference between complying because I could see them, driving the speed limit when there's a police car nearby, the difference between that and understanding why it was important that they lived that way and doing it because they had the heart desire to do that and to please me. And so I think that, again, what Paul wants them to understand is the law is a good law. But what's more important is to have this relationship with God. So our desire, the one in our heart is not only to please God, but to understand why God thinks it's important that we live that way. We can go back to covetousness, particularly this time of year when the world wants to convince us what's the next cool thing that we need. And you think about how all that wanting can stress us out, and all that putting our faith in some other thing to bring us happiness or to bring us fulfillment or to bring us an easier life, that should be what we're looking to God for. So no other thing can do that. Can I get a witness? Yeah, no other thing can do that besides God, can bring that fulfillment and that fullness and that peace. So it doesn't matter what toy or little chinky thing or whatever is the latest thing on the Santa's list. Again, stuff is fun. I like stuff. I love all my fabric. I'm getting to where I love yarn now, but understanding it in right relationship. So Paul is giving us, for his community particularly, the right relationship of them